Welcome to the Damascus Road podcast. On the road to Damascus, Paul had a radical encounter with Jesus and his life was changed forever. That is what we hope and pray for here. Now, on to this week's episode.
Just a bit of background. And again, you probably know this. Peter was a fisherman. He was one of Jesus' original 12 apostles. And he's writing to believers, Jews and Gentiles alike, that were scattered around the world at that time, basically the Middle East, as we would know it today. In the verses just prior to our passage, Paul has reminded his readers of who they are. In 1 Peter 2, 9 through 10, Peter makes reference to the people that you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people belonging to God. God had worked in history to call out for himself a people uniquely in his own. In the Old Testament, this was, of course, Israel. Now Peter's referring to all believers, Jews and Gentiles alike. God has set apart those who know and obey him. He has set them apart for his own purposes, to declare to the world his wonder and glory and mercy. God chose Israel, and now he chooses all believers. This idea of chosen, I think, is significant. I think we all know how good it feels to be chosen for a team. I still play basketball at Arizona State on the Tempe campus as well as on the Polytechnic campus. But on the Poly campus, the way they choose teams is 2 captains are picked, and then those captains choose their team. They're a little more gracious and kind on the Tempe campus. But being of advanced age, I am often the last one chosen, which I understand that. What I really don't like is when there are 11 guys there. It just kind of, there's the countdown to, well, Myke, you'll play in the next game. But that's okay. But when I am picked, it is a marvelous feeling. It's an incredible thing to say, to see there's someone behind me, yet the captain is picking me to be on this team. That's the idea of being chosen. And I hope people that were reading Peter's epistle realized in a much more significant sense that they were chosen by an almighty and loving God to help fulfill his purposes on this earth. They were chosen for that. Okay, let's look at our passage this morning, starting with verse 11. As I read through these verses, I was struck with one profound thought, well, many profound thoughts, but one that I want to camp on. And that's very, very simply that just as Peter said that we are different, we as Christians are called out of the world to be different. He said in verse 9, just as light is fundamentally different from darkness, we are fundamentally different as followers of Jesus. Therefore, we must live differently. Our lives need to look different. And then Peter gives several examples of what that looks like. He looks at 3 primary human relationships. He looks at the government, our relationship to the state. He looks at employee-employer relationship. Well, he looks at slaves and servants. We'll talk about that. Slaves and masters, talk about that in a minute. And then about husband and wife relationships. Those are the examples that he gives. Well, what does different look like? Have you ever been in a situation where you felt profoundly different from those around you? I've led a lot of mission trips around the world and have been in many situations where I knew that the way I saw things, the perspectives I had, the way that I spoke, the way that I dressed, even the way that I thought made me look different. So I've been in a lot of situations where I knew what it felt like to be different. In Poland, for instance, they point not with their finger, but with their middle finger. That's just how they point. So you have to get used to getting flipped off all the time if you spend much time in Poland. The middle finger is flying up all the time because that's how people point. That's different. In India, I was invited to join a service in a Hindu temple. And I thought about how different that would be for me. The music, the lighting, everything was different. I really feel horrible that I didn't go in. I wish I would have, but I was standing there, and the guy said, hey, why don't you come in and join us? He wasn't pressure at all. He just wanted to invite me in, and I said no, and I've always felt badly about it. But again, I felt it was so different seeing how they worshiped what they do. I lived in Kenya for 2 years after college. I took my electrical engineering degree and became a high school teacher and basketball coach. And I was the only Anglo for a long time in a black African church. I was different. Every Sunday, I felt like I stood out. So when you're different, it affects how you view yourself and how you perceive others looking at you, how you see yourself and what you're thinking others are thinking about you. Well, Peter continues this idea in verse 11 where he says, we are aliens and strangers. I have often thought about how immigrants to the United States feel this way, whatever country they are from. Paul tells believers in Philippians 3:20 that our real citizenship is in heaven. And the implication here by Peter, I think, is that the world is not your real home. Our ultimate home is in heaven. Therefore, we shouldn't live like this is our ultimate home. We must abstain from sinful desires. An alien wants to be home. If you remember the old movie E.T. from many years ago, he just wanted to phone home? He wanted to be home. And that's where the movie ends up. So if you're an alien, if you're out of place, you just have a strong desire to be back home. In verse 12, Peter continues that we are to live our lives in such a way that non-believers take note and really have no reason to put blame on us. Instead, they realize the work of God in our lives and give him glory. It's very interesting in verse 12, Peter says that they may see your good deeds and glorify God. That word see is a very simple word, 3 letters, yet it means much more than kind of a casual observation. It indicates a careful watching over a period of time. You're being observed, you're being watched, and people are making evaluations based on what they see. That's the idea of the word see. If you wear the label Christian, people will see you. They will watch you, and they will draw conclusions about how you live and why you live the way you do. People, we are different. Therefore, we must live differently. And make no mistake, people are watching. The world is watching us. John chapter 17 is one of my favorite passages of Scripture to preach on, to speak on. And if you remember those last few chapters of John, Jesus is enjoying a last meal, a last evening with his 12 disciples, and the night before he's crucified. But in context, in chapter 17, you see Jesus praying, and he prays for his disciples. He prays for himself, he prays for his disciples, and then he prays for the entire world. But when he prays for his disciples, he asks God, his Father, to protect them. And then he says, I have given them your word, in John 17:14, I have given them your word, and the world has hated them. He makes it very clear to his followers that they are not of the world. They live in the world, but they are not of it. They should not be shaped by the world. But they are sent into the world for a very specific purpose. They're in the world, not of the world, but they are sent into the world. And we must see ourselves that way today. And that means we live differently. Jesus and the New Testament give some pretty radical examples of what it means to live differently. We are told to love our enemies. We sacrifice our life in order to really find it. Our thought life is just as serious as our actions. Real love means putting the other person first. We could go on, but all these are pretty different ideas about what it means to live as a follower of Jesus. In verse 13, Peter starts with a few specific ways that we can be different. The first section, verses 13 through 17, Peter talks to the believer's relationship to the state, to the government. And if you want to, this compares a lot with Paul in Romans chapter 13, the first few verses of Romans 13. Paul talks about the relationship to the state. And he says we're to submit to our government because God has placed these rulers in power. And if we rebel against our authorities, we are rebelling against God. You have to remember when Peter wrote his epistle, it was at a time when Peter's world was being ruled by a horrible tyrant. Nero was king. And for people to heard that they need to submit to this king would have been pretty unusual thinking, pretty radical thinking for his audience. But that's what Peter was saying. I don't know about you, but sometimes I have a real hard time with this. I don't care which side of the political fence you are on. I realize that some of the things I may say this morning as I work through this are going to sound political, and I probably shouldn't be political. Just understand it. It's the world in which we live. But I don't care which side of the political fence you're on, it's often tough to think God put these people in power. And some folks may say, well, this was just Paul and Peter talking about their situations. But as I compare their times to our times, it leads me to believe their words are just as applicable for us today. And perhaps the real question is not so much who has power over me, but how do I respond to their power? Let me give a few hopefully thought-provoking examples of what this might mean. A question that I've often asked myself, I don't know if you have, is it a sin to speed? 1 mile over the speed limit? 2 miles over the speed limit? 3, 5? I set my cruise control this morning. It was not, 75? Is that what the speed limit is between here? It was probably a shade above that. Is that a sin? The state says this is a speed limit. Well, I'm not going to abide that. I'm going to drive at this speed. Are we disrespecting our authorities by doing that? That can be lunchtime conversation. That's not one of your reflection questions. But we face much graver issues than speed limits at this time in our nation's history. We've just seen a horrible mass shooting in Texas, which has rocked a lot of people. It raises questions about school safety, about gun control. Do we do more gun control? Do we do less gun control? And again, I'm not siding politically. I'm just saying it raises questions. And what do we do? What decisions does the state, the government make, and then how do I respond to those decisions? What will the Supreme Court decide about abortion rights? Is Roe versus Wade, is that going to be overturned? And whichever way it goes, how do I respond? How does that affect my world? Pandemic. I hope we're getting toward the end of this. We keep thinking we're toward the end, and things happen. I remember the president of ASU, Michael Crow, 3 years ago when this thing first started, when people were expecting it to be gone in a few weeks or a few months, he said we're in the midst of a 3 to 5 year experience here, which now is proving very prophetic. But today, as of today, June 12th, you don't have to have a test anymore to get back in the U.S. Did you know that? That was just, as of today, you don't have to have a COVID test. I was in Mexico just a few weeks ago and had to have a COVID test to get back in the U.S. But anyway, so that's another issue. A real life example for me, the last 2 years I was in Minneapolis, I worked for Pizza Hut, delivering pizza. I may step on some toes here. I apologize if I do. But I would come home every night and faithfully count every penny of my tips. Then I would claim this as income on my taxes. Folks thought I was crazy. Myke, that's not income. Yes, it is. According to the law, that is income. And if you claim your income, you need to claim your tips. I wonder if even the man that did my taxes thought I was crazy. But no one counts their tip money, but I did. But I believed that the state and the federal government required that of me, and it did not conflict with any law of God that I knew of. Therefore, I felt I was, I should do that. It was the right thing to do. We've read about communities such as Seattle and Portland, and I was in Portland just a couple of months ago and just see what's going on there, where people live and issues that are surrounding that, uprisings and homeless situation, all that kind of stuff. These are big issues that raise questions about the state's role. Is the government there for my material well-being or my moral well-being or neither or both? Those are questions I think we ask. We like to say that we will obey God rather than human laws when they conflict, but sometimes it's hard for me to know when they conflict and when obeying one means disobeying the other. We strive to obey the law as long as doing so does not violate God's commands, but it's not always an easy decision to make. Verse 14 has a very interesting statement there toward the end. It says, the governors who are sent by him to punish those who do wrong and to commend those who do right. To commend those who do right. I don't know that I'd really thought much about that until working through this week. The New American Standard Translation says, praise of those who do right. Governors are sent to punish those who do wrong and to commend those who do right. So it's a question. When is the last time your government has commended you for doing the right thing or praised you? Some would say, oh, we got stimulus checks a couple of years ago. That was, you can argue whether that was a good idea or bad idea. Again, I'm not going to go there, but, has the government rewarded or complimented you recently? Has anyone got a recent text from the White House that says, well done, you are a great citizen, your country appreciates you? Maybe if they were asking for a donation, they would say something like that. But, the governors are there to commend us, but that's something we don't often think about. Anyway, Peter mentions that. Verse 15 is similar to verse 12, where Peter says, a good life silences the ignorant. Good citizenship silences false charges. That phrase, put to silence, again, is interesting. It means to muzzle, to prevent someone from speaking, as well as to make someone cease speaking. That's the idea, put to silence. But if we live good lives, as we should, no one should be able to speak against us. I once heard there's so much in the news over the years about improper relationships. If you're somebody that's in the news, whether you're an athlete or a politician or actor or something like that. But I remember years ago, I heard of all the caution that Billy Graham's team would take whenever he would go somewhere. Rooms would be checked. He would never be seen alone with a female. I mean, all these precautions were taken. And as a result, I don't know of any serious scandal that was ever brought against him. He was very cautious about that. And I know of no accusations. Maybe there were, but was nothing major against him. Verse 16 says, we are free to live in submission to earthly authorities and to God, as long as submission to human authorities does not make us in conflict with God's law. Real freedom comes when we subject ourselves to God's law and serve him only. And then Peter summarizes this in verse 17. He tells us, show proper respect to everyone, love the brotherhood of believers, fear God, honor the king. Those are the things we need to do. Starting with verse 18, Paul goes into a different example of how to live and how to live differently, where he says, slaves or servants, submit to your masters. The question always comes up, exactly what is being said about slavery? We don't really have time to explore that today, but the New Testament writers did not seem to condemn slavery, but accepted it as part of first century life and culture. The word translated slave here, I'm not going to try to pronounce it, but at least in this instance, refers to a household or domestic slave or servant. And it may be that Peter is simply referring to the household as a common social institution. But anyway, slavery in the first century was markedly different from our perceptions of slavery in the U.S. in the 19th century, 18th century, or even slavery as it exists today with human trafficking and many other things that go on. But still, these men and women and families, they were not free to go where they wanted to go. They were not free to do whatever they wanted to do. There were definite constraints there. Slavery was a reality of the day in Peter's world. But still, Peter makes some pretty radical, different statements as to how these slaves are to relate to their masters. These slaves who are followers of Jesus are to submit to their masters with respect, regardless of whether they are good and gentle or harsh and unreasonable. No distinction made. If you're a Christian slave, obey your master, whether your master is a follower of Jesus or not. A slave did not automatically become a free person upon becoming a Christian, but the slave should now behave as only a Christian slave would. I think that's the encouragement Peter is giving. I think there's an obvious application to a boss-employee relationship today, and I'm sure you've heard this before. because we don't, in our context, we don't experience slavery, at least like Peter did then. But we are to obey a good boss, but we're also to obey a bad boss. Well, I want to tell you a bit today about my supervisor. He's a wonderful man. He is kind, considerate, understanding. He's fabulous. A great musician, a godly husband and father, a talented baseball player. He has no faults that I can see. I can't say enough good things about him. He's easy to submit to. He's fair. But we haven't talked in a couple of months, so that may have changed. Ryan, are you here today? Are you? Oh, there you are. There. Okay, good. Glad you're here to hear all that. That's very true. I don't think I made anything up there. No faults? Well, ask Megan about that. But most bosses I have been great. Ryan's a fabulous supervisor. I love him. I appreciate him very much. But over the years, most of my supervisors I've been very happy with. But I've had some who were not that way. I was once dismissed from a position for reasons that I felt were quite unjustified, but I still attempted to relate to that individual with respect, even though it was very difficult at times. But the application of Peter's lesson is to treat both with respect, whether it's a good boss or a less than stellar supervisor. Verses 19 and 20, Peter goes on, he says, it's good to suffer for doing the right thing, but no big deal to suffer when you've done wrong, because you should suffer when you do wrong. Peter is showing us some of the how we should relate to those who oversee us. In the last few verses, Peter gives the ultimate example of one who suffered unjustly, Jesus Christ. Christians are called to suffer injustice with patient endurance because Christ set the example for us as he suffered patiently. We need to emulate Christ's example of suffering, even if it is unjust. Jesus ultimately entrusted himself to God. Jesus did not complain. He prayed. Jesus suffered not because he felt he deserved the punishment, but because he knew his death was necessary according to God's plan for the forgiveness of many. Last couple of verses, verse 24 and 25, Christ's death for us so that we can live righteous lives. Christ's wounds heal us. And then wraps up, we were lost and aimless, but now we are reconnected with God. Okay, let's wrap this up. We are different, and we should live differently. Peter lists a few examples. Christians should submit to authority, whether the authority are believers or not. He gives slaves and government as examples. The next section talks about husbands and wives. I wish I could be here for that one. But there are many other more mundane ways that we can evidence to the world that we are different people. Short of us all tattooing big neon crosses on our forehead, I guess we could do that. That would definitely make us look different. But I was just trying to do a brainstorm a little bit about some things that we can do. I think, and this is a hard one to say, I talked to my students up in Poly about this. What are some ways that you can intentionally be different to show the world that you are different? It's one thing to not engage in sin, what sinful desires, or what Peter says earlier. It's one thing to not engage in that because that you shouldn't do that as a Christian. But are there some things that we can intentionally do to evidence that we're a Christian? And these are some things that I thought about. A lot of these are my own personal examples because they're things that I've dealt with. Keep your yards clean. I think that's an example to the world. We don't keep a very clean yard, sorry. But I think that's one way that we can witness or show the world that we're different. Don't complain about unruly neighbors to the police unless you go talk to your neighbors first. Don't badmouth your oppressive boss to your barber or stylist. Steer clear of hateful gossip in any form and in any context. what's your attitude on recreational sports teams? As I say, I play basketball in a couple of different contexts at ASU. And when I play in Tempe, the older crowd, I'm called Preacher Myke. There are several Mykes up there. There are a handful of us all named Myke. And most of the people know I'm a weird minister or something. I'm not sure what goes through their minds. But I'm called Preacher Myke. So I have to be careful. I have to be on guard as to how I conduct myself up there. Most of the time it's okay, but sometimes somebody just really gets under your skin and you want to let them have it physically with a foul or verbally or something like that. But I try to let people say, I live to different standards. God called me out of the world to be different, and I need to live different standards. The list could go on and on and on about ways or things that we can do. But we're going to wrap up here. You're going to go into a reflection time in just a moment. But just, 3 things that I think about. We are different, so we should live different. What might that look like? And like I said, I think some of these will be in your reflection. We should submit to the government, to the state. We live in challenging times. Like I've mentioned, shooting, abortion, pandemic, vaccines, masks, disrespecting the police. Go on and on and on with all these issues. How do we submit to our authorities and honor God at the same time, especially when we think there's a conflict there? And then the third thing, submit to your overseers. What is your boss like? And again, this is an application of what Peter was talking about when he was talking about slaves, obey your masters. But what is your boss like? Are they good? Are they bad? It also raises a question when things are going south with your supervisor. Are we called as Christians to stay in a bad situation, or do we leave? Those are not easy questions, but there are things that we need to think about. My prayer for you, for all of us, is that we may live in such a way that those around us see us as people who are completely different. Father, thank you for your truth expressed through your word this morning. Lord, help us think about what it really means to live differently, that we might be a light for you in our world. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen.
Thank you for joining the Damascus Road podcast. Our mission is to follow Jesus together by being with God, loving everyone, transforming people, developing leaders, growing new ministries, and changing the world. You can find out more about us online at DamascusRoadTucson.com.